Today, we delve into a chilling case from the quiet suburb of Metairie, Louisiana, where a shocking affair turned deadly. A young man's life was brutally cut short in a crime that left the community in shock. This is the story of Brandon Thibodeaux, an 18-year-old whose life was tragically ended by a twisted affair that spiraled out of control. Brandon Thibodeaux was just 18 years old, full of dreams and hope for the future. He lived in Metairie, the quiet suburb of New Orleans. Brandon was a senior at East Jefferson High School, where he excelled in both academics and auto shop. He had a real passion for cars, spending hours working on engines and dreaming of one day opening his own auto repair shop. His friends often saw him with grease-stained hands, tinkering with old cars in his driveway. Brandon lived with his grandmother, Mabel, a woman who had gone blind and needed his daily care. Despite his age, Brandon took on this responsibility with maturity far beyond his years. He balanced school, a part-time job at a local garage, and caring for his grandmother without complaint. People in the neighborhood often commented on his kindness, noting how he always made time to help anyone who needed a hand. Brandon had been dating Lee Gerard for 2 years. Lee, also 18, was a smart, driven young woman who shared his dreams of a bright future. They talked about getting married after graduation and starting a family. Brandon often saved his money to take Lee out to nice places like Café du Monde, where they would dream about their future over a nice meal. The couple was inseparable, and everyone expected them to have a long, happy life together. But beneath the surface lay a dark secret. Brandon was having an affair with Lee's mother, Poet Gerard, a 43-year-old woman who ran a multi-level marketing company called Beauty Buys. Poet was attractive and successful, but she had a complicated relationship with her daughter, often competing with her for the attention of men. Brandon's affair with Poet was a secret that weighed heavily on him and complicated his life in ways he hadn't anticipated. On the morning of August 12, 2021, Metairie, Louisiana, was already feeling the oppressive summer heat. Around 8 a.m., Mabel noticed something was wrong. Being blind and dependent on Brandon for care, she hadn't heard him moving around the house that morning. Worried, she called out to him, but there was no answer. Sensing something was off, she managed to dial a neighbor, Mrs. Alice Dupree, for help. Mrs. Dupree, a retired nurse who lived just 2 houses down, rushed over. She had known Brandon since he was a little boy and couldn't imagine anything being seriously wrong. But as soon as she stepped into the house, she felt a chill. The living room was eerily quiet, and there was an unusual metallic smell in the air. Mrs. Dupree called out to Brandon, but the house remained silent. Following the scent to Brandon's bedroom, she pushed the door open. The sight before her was unimaginable. Brandon's lifeless body lay sprawled on the floor, practically floating in his own blood. He had been brutally stabbed multiple times, and his eyes were almost gouged out. The knife, still soaked in blood, lay on the floor beside him. Mrs. Dupree froze in shock, her hand trembling as she dialed 911. "Oh, Sheriff, there's blood everywhere," she stammered. Within minutes, police and paramedics arrived at the modest one-story home on West Midi Avenue. The flashing lights and the crowd of neighbors who gathered outside added to the surreal atmosphere. As the first responders entered the house, they were met with a gruesome scene that would haunt them for years. Mabel, still in her chair in the living room, kept asking what was happening, unaware of the horror just a few rooms away. The Metairie Police Department arrived at Brandon Thibodeaux's home within minutes of Mrs. Dupree's 911 call. Leading the investigation was Detective Michael Duval, a seasoned investigator with over 20 years on the force, known for his no-nonsense approach and dedication. He was joined by Detective Rene Martinez, a younger, sharp-minded officer with a keen eye for detail. As they entered the house, the crime scene was immediately overwhelming. Blood spattered the walls and floor, creating a chaotic pattern that told the story of extreme violence and desperation. The smell of iron hung thick in the air, mixing with the oppressive heat of the August morning. Brandon's body lay crumpled on the floor, the brutality of the attack evident from the multiple stab wounds and the near gouging of his eyes. The kitchen knife used in the attack, a common but deadly weapon, was found beside him, covered in blood. Detective Duval, despite his years of experience, felt a knot in his stomach as he surveyed the scene. He knew immediately that this wasn't a random act of violence. The ferocity of the attack suggested something deeply personal. This wasn't just a murder. Duval believed this was a crime of passion. Martinez began photographing the scene, carefully documenting every detail. They collected evidence meticulously, ensuring nothing was overlooked. Outside, the neighbors murmured among themselves, trying to make sense of the tragedy that had struck their quiet community. Detective Duval assigned officers to canvass the neighborhood, hoping someone might have seen or heard something unusual in a close-knit place like Metairie, where everyone knew each other. The first suspect on Detective Duval's list was Poet Gerard, the mother of Brandon's girlfriend Lee. Poet was 43 years old and had always been the center of attention in Metairie's social circles. She was known for her striking looks and her successful multi-level marketing company, Beauty Buys, which sold cosmetics and skincare products. Some locals whispered that her business was a scam, but Poet dismissed the criticism, enjoying the financial rewards. Poet had a complicated relationship with her daughter Lee. While they appeared close, friends noticed an underlying tension, often stemming from Poet's jealousy of Lee's youth and beauty. This rivalry took a dark turn when Poet began an affair with Brandon Thibodeaux, her daughter's boyfriend. The affair was a closely guarded secret, known only to the two of them. The kind of secret that could destroy lives. When Detective Duval and Detective Martinez brought Poet in for questioning, she was visibly shaken but tried to maintain her composure. She dressed impeccably in a tailored pantsuit, her makeup flawless, but there was a nervousness in her eyes that didn't go unnoticed. The detectives started with routine questions about her relationship with Brandon and her whereabouts on the night of the murder. Poet claimed she had been home alone, working late into the night on her business. However, when pressed about the affair, her demeanor changed. She became defensive, her answers short and clipped. She denied the affair at first, but when presented with evidence, she broke down, tears streaming down her face as she confessed. "He was my angel boy," she cried. "I would never hurt him." Despite her emotional outburst, Detective Duval wasn't convinced. Her obsession with Brandon and the intense jealousy she harbored toward her daughter made her a prime suspect. The second suspect was Lee Gerard, the 18-year-old daughter of Poet and girlfriend of the victim, Brandon Thibodeaux. Lee was a bright, ambitious young woman who had just graduated high school in June 2021 and was looking forward to starting college in the fall. Friends and family described Lee as kind-hearted, but sometimes overshadowed by her mother's dominant personality. When detectives brought Lee in for questioning, she appeared emotionally drained. Dressed in jeans and a t-shirt from her high school senior class, she seemed much younger than her age, almost childlike in her grief. Detective Duval and Detective Martinez began the interrogation gently, asking her to recount her relationship with Brandon and how she found out about the affair. Lee's voice trembled as she spoke, her eyes filled with tears. She described how she had accidentally stumbled upon sexually explicit texts between her mother and Brandon a few days before his death, leading to a heated argument. "I loved Brandon, and I didn't want to lose him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. However, when asked about her whereabouts on the night of the murder, Lee's story became less clear. She insisted she had been at a sleepover at her friend Taylor's house just a few blocks away from Brandon's house, but struggled to provide details about the evening. As the investigation deepened, Detective Duval understood that Richard Gerard's character was central to unraveling the web of relationships that led to Brandon Thibodeaux's murder. On the surface, Richard projected the image of a devoted husband and father, but behind the polished facade lay an individual grappling with insecurities and the fear of losing control. Richard, aged 47, was not just a successful personal injury attorney. He was also a man who had meticulously crafted a public persona that masked his deeper struggles. Friends often remarked on his ambition and work ethic, but whispers of marital strife and disconnection from his family frequently surfaced. Poet's frequent social outings and flirtations were subjects of gossip, yet Richard seemed to dismiss these red flags, focusing instead on maintaining appearances. During the police questioning, Richard entered the interrogation room with an air of indignation. He wore a tailored suit that spoke to his professionalism, yet there was an underlying tension in his posture. "How dare you question my integrity?" he began, his voice betraying a mix of anger and hurt. Brandon was a family friend. Detectives Duval and Martinez quickly shifted the conversation toward the dynamics of Richard's marriage. "You've been married to Poet for over 20 years. Have there been any issues that could have affected her state of mind?" Duval asked, observing Richard closely. Richard's expression darkened. "Every marriage has its challenges," he retorted, "but we always manage." However, his tone suggested that their relationship had become increasingly strained. As the detectives pressed further, they uncovered a troubling pattern. Richard's relentless focus on work left Poet feeling neglected and seeking attention elsewhere. The detectives also began to explore the possibility that Richard's jealousy could have played a role in Brandon's murder. "What do you think about your wife's relationship with Brandon?" Duval probed. Richard's reaction was immediate and intense. "That was just a fling, a meaningless distraction," he snapped. "You can't be serious in thinking I would harm anyone over this." Despite his protestations, the detectives noted the cold edge to his voice. The simmering rage hinted at a deeper emotional investment, perhaps an unacknowledged fear of losing not only Poet, but also the image of the family he had worked so hard to uphold. As they reviewed Richard's alibi, discrepancies began to surface. His claims of being at a business dinner were undermined by conflicting witness statements. This inconsistency fueled suspicions that he might have had the opportunity to confront Brandon directly, especially given his mounting frustration with the situation. With evidence piling up and tensions running high, detectives Duval and Martinez devised a strategy for a final confrontation. They believed that bringing Richard, Poet, and Lee together in one room would ignite a chain reaction, potentially revealing hidden truths that had yet to surface. On the day of the confrontation, the atmosphere in the police station was charged with unease. Poet arrived first, her heart racing. She had been trying to maintain a sense of normalcy, but the weight of her guilt loomed heavy. Lee, still grappling with her conflicting feelings toward her mother, entered next, her expression a mix of anger and confusion. Finally, Richard strode in, his confidence masking the uncertainty lurking beneath the surface. Detective Duval initiated the confrontation by outlining the evidence against them. "We know about the affair, and we know emotions were running high. Let's be honest about what happened that night," he stated, his eyes scanning each individual. The air was thick with tension as Richard's defensiveness began to bubble up again. Poet, overwhelmed by the mounting pressure, couldn't hold back her emotions any longer. "I loved Brandon. He made me feel alive," she exclaimed, tears streaming down her face. The confession sent shockwaves through the room. Lee's heart ached as she processed her mother's words, torn between loyalty and betrayal. "How could you do this to us?" she shouted, anger rising in her voice. "You think this is about love? It's destroyed our family." Richard, ever the lawyer, attempted to regain control of the narrative. "This is a distraction. None of this justifies accusing us of murder," he interjected, his voice rising with desperation. Detective Martinez pressed Lee further, knowing that she had been impacted by the turmoil. "You were upset about the texts, weren't you? Did you confront Brandon? Did you confront your mother?" Lee's defenses crumbled, and she admitted, "I was furious. I found out everything and tried to talk to her about it. But she didn't care. It was like I didn't matter anymore." In the face of the accusations, Richard's emotional facade cracked. "This isn't about us. It's about you both being reckless and ruining everything," he shouted, his frustration spilling over. The confrontation was spiraling, and the detectives recognized that they were close to uncovering something crucial. Finally, Detective Duval laid the evidence on the table, revealing a witness who saw Poet leaving Brandon's house shortly after the murder. "We know one of you was there that night. You need to tell us the truth." Richard's face paled, the realization dawning upon him. The facade of control he had maintained began to crumble. The once confident father now appeared vulnerable, as if he understood the gravity of the situation. As the confrontation reached its peak, the emotional toll weighed heavily on Poet. She could no longer bear the pressure of lying or denying her actions. The truth demanded to be spoken, and she felt a compelling need to confess. not just to the detectives, but also to her family, especially Lee. I didn't mean for it to happen, Poet sobbed, her body shaking as she clutched her head in despair. I loved Brandon, but when he started talking about leaving me for someone else, I lost control. I never wanted it to go this far. Detective Duval leaned in, urging her to share the details. What happened that night, Poet? We need to know everything. The confession spilled from her lips like a torrential rain. Poet recounted the events leading up to the tragedy, revealing how their relationship had become increasingly toxic. I went to confront him about the affair. I was so jealous, I felt betrayed. When he told me it was over, I just snapped. I grabbed the knife, and before I knew it, I had stabbed him. Lee's heart shattered at her mother's words. The anger and love she had felt for Brandon collided with the reality of her mother's actions. You took him away from me. How could you do that? She cried, unable to comprehend the gravity of the situation. Poet's sobs filled the room as she realized the devastation her actions had wrought. I thought I was protecting us. I thought I could make it right, but I only made it worse. I never wanted to hurt him. I just wanted him to love me. As the confession unfolded, the detectives absorbed the raw emotion in the room. Richard, who had tried to maintain a stoic facade, was now visibly shaken. The family he had fought to protect was crumbling, and he could no longer shield them from the reality of their circumstances. In that moment, Richard's anger shifted to despair. This isn't how it was supposed to go, he exclaimed, the pain evident in his voice. We were supposed to be a family. Detective Duval took a deep breath, understanding the complexity of the situation. He could see how the web of betrayal, jealousy, and emotional turmoil had led them to this tragic moment. As the truth hung heavily in the air, the gravity of Poet's confession echoed through the room, sealing her fate and that of the Gerard family. The impact of the confession reverberated beyond the interrogation room. As Poet was taken into custody, the family's life would never be the same. Brandon's murder had not only destroyed a life, but also irrevocably fractured a family, leaving a trail of grief, anger, and heartbreak in its wake. Detective Duval recognized that while justice might be served, the emotional scars would linger, shaping the lives of those involved for years to come. The tragedy of Brandon Thibodeaux would be a cautionary tale, a poignant reminder of how love, jealousy, and the desperate need for connection can lead to irrevocable consequences. In the aftermath of the tragic events surrounding Brandon Thibodeaux's murder, Poet Gerard found herself enveloped in a haze of guilt and regret. After her confession, she was taken into custody, and the reality of her actions weighed heavily upon her. The stark, cold walls of her jail cell became a prison for both her body and her mind as memories of Brandon flooded her thoughts, his laughter, their shared dreams, and the life they could have built together. Each recollection felt like a piercing reminder of what she had lost and what she had taken from others. As she sat alone with her thoughts, the depth of her remorse became unbearable. She would often whisper to herself, "What have I done?" grappling with the stark realization that her choices had not only ended a life, but had also shattered her family. The tumultuous legal proceedings that followed her arrest became a public spectacle, and the media frenzy surrounding her case only intensified her feelings of isolation and despair. The headlines painted her as both a victim and a villain, capturing the sensational aspects of her extramarital affair, while glossing over the emotional turmoil that had driven her to such desperate actions. During her trial, Poet faced a barrage of emotions. The courtroom was filled with tension as she confronted the pain etched on the faces of Brandon's family. They were reminders of the lives forever altered by her actions, and the anguish in their eyes made her heart ache with guilt. When she was required to testify, the weight of their grief enveloped her, amplifying her own sorrow. "I'm so sorry," she would murmur to them, tears streaming down her cheeks, but she knew that mere words could never suffice in conveying the depth of her remorse. In the months leading up to the trial, Poet sought solace through counseling sessions while in jail. These sessions provided a rare opportunity for introspection, allowing her to explore the tangled web of her emotions, guilt, sorrow, and the desperate yearning for forgiveness. It was a journey fraught with challenges. She confronted her feelings of worthlessness, and the overwhelming burden of having caused so much pain. Through therapy, she began to piece together the fragmented parts of her life, seeking to understand the motivations behind her actions and the reasons for her emotional breakdown. As the child progressed, Poet's world felt increasingly constricted. She became acutely aware of the public perception of her, often feeling like a pariah. Conversations around her case swirled in the media, often depicting her as a woman scorned, driven to violence by her own desires. Yet amid the chaos, there were moments of clarity. Poet began to realize that while she could not undo the past, she could work towards becoming a better person, someone who learned from her mistakes rather than letting them define her. In jail, Poet started a journal to document her thoughts and feelings. Writing became a therapeutic outlet, a means to navigate the storm within her. She poured her heart onto the pages, exploring her guilt, her love for Brandon, and her aspirations for redemption. Through writing, she found a sense of agency, reclaiming a part of herself that felt lost in the turmoil of her choices. "I will find a way to make this right," she wrote, not knowing how, but hoping that by expressing her remorse, she could begin to heal. As the trial neared its conclusion, Poet grappled with the reality of her potential sentence. The prospect of imprisonment loomed large, yet she understood that her punishment was a consequence of her actions. A part of her believed she deserved it. However, another part yearned for forgiveness, not just from others, but from herself. She envisioned a future where she could turn her pain into purpose, using her experience to help others facing similar struggles. In the final days of her trial, Poet was confronted by Brandon's family in the courtroom. They had come to voice their pain and share their memories of him, a man whose life had been abruptly cut short. Poet felt their anguish piercing through her like 1,000 daggers. She listened as they spoke of his kindness, his laughter, and the void his absence had left in their lives. At that moment, she realized the enormity of her actions and the irrevocable damage they had caused. When it was her turn to speak, she stood trembling, her heart pounding in her chest. She managed to choke out an apology, expressing her deep sorrow for what had transpired. "I wish I could take it back," she whispered, tears flowing freely. The weight of her grief and regret filled the courtroom, a heavy silence following her words. In the aftermath of the trial, as she awaited her sentencing, Poet found herself in a space of reflection. The verdict felt inevitable, yet she understood that her journey was just beginning. Each day in her cell became a lesson in humility and acceptance. She sought to transform her pain into something meaningful, believing that through her own redemption, she could honor Brandon's memory. Her heart ached for the life they would never share, but she was determined to use her experience as a catalyst for change, not only within herself, but also for others who might find themselves on a similar path. The journey ahead would be long and arduous, but Poet was committed to facing her demons and seeking forgiveness from those she had hurt, including herself. The road to healing was uncertain, but she was resolute in her belief that, in time, she could emerge from the darkness and begin to shine a light on the lessons learned from her tragic mistakes. It was a daunting task, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope within her.